Welcome to this explainer. So, preschool television is usually thought of as this completely safe haven, right? Picture it. You've got a world filled with gentle acoustic guitars, sweet little lessons about sharing, super bright primary colors, and wholesome characters that honestly feel like old friends to our kids. It's pretty much the one place on TV where you can just let your guard down. But every so often, an episode airs that completely shatters that peace. The gentle vibes vanish, and suddenly parents are literally sprinting across the living room, scrambling for the remote control to shut the screen off. I'm so glad you've joined me today because we are looking at exactly what happens when that carefully curated preschool peace gets broken. And that brings us to the core premise of our investigation today. What actually happens when preschool TV goes wrong? We're going to examine two very specific, highly controversial broadcasts that cause genuine, widespread outrage among parents and media watchdogs alike. And we're not talking about minor missteps or little animated flubs here. These are episodes that sparked massive, heated debates about what is actually safe and appropriate for our youngest, most impressionable minds to consume. If you're a parent, a babysitter, or honestly just someone fascinated by media psychology, understanding where this line is drawn is absolutely crucial. Okay, let's dive into this. We'll be doing a sort of trial by media today. First, we'll introduce the two episodes in question. Then we'll recap the events of Something Special and Counting Spaghetti. After that, we'll analyze why Outside sparked outrage and the problem with Counting Spaghetti. Finally, we'll look at which episode actually deserves a ban. Let's kick things off with Chapter 1, the two controversial episodes. Okay, so on one side, we have the incredibly popular, long-running BBC favorite CBeebies Something Special. And on the other side, we have the much newer animated hit from Cartoonito, Lu and the Bally Bunch. Now, what makes this comparison so fascinating is that they are accused of two completely different things. One is accused of causing a genuine psychological fright, literally terrifying its audience, while the other is accused of modeling terrible, real-world behavior that kids immediately start copying. Let's set the stage with Chapter 2, Something Special, Outside Recap. The episode we're looking at is Series 7, Episode 15, titled Outside. Now, just to give you some context, Something Special is typically an incredibly gentle, comforting show. It stars Justin Fletcher as the beloved character Mr. Tumble, and its main educational goal is to introduce kids to Makaton signing, which is this really gentle way of communicating using signs and symbols, all while exploring the world around them. This particular episode was meant to be a joyful, vibrant exploration of outdoor festivals and traditional cultural clothing from around the globe. Sounds perfectly innocent, right? Entirely on brand for the network. Well, here is exactly where things took a jarring turn. Right in the middle of this uplifting segment celebrating cultural clothing, there was a sudden visual shift to a massive, elaborate, ceremonial headdress. Now, what's really interesting here is that the concept of the headdress wasn't the issue at all. It was the execution on screen. The sheer scale of it, the dramatic way it moved, and just the absolute suddenness of the visual shift caught young viewers completely off guard. Just imagine you're a toddler watching a quiet, predictable show, and suddenly a towering, unfamiliar face covering completely fills the TV. It was a massive aesthetic shock to the system for an audience expecting the usual, gentle pacing of Mr. Tumble. Moving right along to Chapter 3, Counting Spaghetti Recap. So let's pivot to our second case study to make sure we give it equal weight. This brings us to Lu and the Bally Bunch, specifically Series 1, Episode 12, titled Counting Spaghetti. The setup for this one is wonderfully simple. It's art time at Shell School. We have Barnaby, who is happily painting a rather chaotic, cheesy cheese monster, and Lu, who is meticulously painting her beloved toy T-Rex, Tara. It's an adorable scenario you'd totally expect. But then an accident happens. Barnaby accidentally drops some of his yellow paint right onto Lu's T-Rex drawing. And instead of brushing it off or, simply crying, Lu flies into an absolute rage. She actively seeks malicious revenge. She tries to splat her own paint onto Barnaby's cheese monster while they argue bitterly back and forth. It gets so out of hand that another character, Elodie, has to step in to teach them to calm down by counting spaghetti, which is basically a coping mechanism where they count to 8 while moving their arms around like floppy noodles. Now that we've got the facts, let's jump to Chapter 4, Why Outside Sparked Outrage. We're going to examine the prosecution and the defense for our first episode, starting with that immediate, visceral backlash to Something Special. To really understand the outrage, you've got to look at the living room impact, the real, on-the-ground panic. Take a look at this quote from a parent on a popular UK parenting forum. They wrote, "My 2-year-old absolutely loves Mr. Tumble, but when that headdress appeared on screen, he burst into tears and hid behind the sofa. Just imagine that genuine distress for a second. This perfectly illustrates the sheer scale of the panic. Toddlers were left completely terrified of a show and a character they normally trust 100%. In the eyes of these parents, the visual was just way too intense for a toddler demographic to process. But in the spirit of a fair trial, we really must look at the producer's defense. Their intent, after all, was entirely positive. They argued strongly that the scene was meant to foster cultural appreciation and inclusiveness, not fear. The creators were simply trying to showcase the beautiful, rich reality of global festivals to young viewers. They were just totally unaware that the sheer visual intensity and the sudden appearance of the headdress would inadvertently trigger such a massive fear response in toddlers. So the crucial point is understanding the psychology of what actually happened in these living rooms. Media analysts categorize this specific reaction as passive fright. This is a temporary state of fear caused by an intense aesthetic choice. Yes, it is undeniably a scary moment for the child, but it is temporary. Because the fear is purely visual and lacks a complex, real-world threat, the toddler's brain resets quickly once the screen goes dark. The fear fades very rapidly once the TV is turned off, and the child is typically easily comforted by a parent's hug. The psychological damage simply isn't systemic or long-lasting. Let's shift our focus back to our animated bugs in Chapter 5, The Problem with Counting Spaghetti. Why did a seemingly simple disagreement at a fictional preschool spark such heavy, sustained criticism? Well, the core complaint from parents regarding counting spaghetti isn't about fear at all. It's entirely about modeled behavior. Parents argued that this episode basically functions as a literal how-to guide for tantrums. From the perspective of furious parents, Lu doesn't just get upset, she acts like an unpunished brat, taking malicious revenge over what was clearly an innocent accident. Instead of teaching conflict resolution from the jump, the show puts deeply antisocial, vengeful behavior on full, uninterrupted display for highly impressionable minds to absorb. Again, remaining completely impartial here, the creators of Lu and the Bally Bunch have a robust defense. They maintain that their show aims to depict the real big feelings that preschoolers genuinely experience on a daily basis. Their core educational philosophy is that by allowing kids to see messy social mistakes happen on screen, they can better understand and navigate their own complex emotions. And this brilliantly illustrates the psychological counterargument, a concept known as active mimicry. You see, toddlers learn almost entirely through imitation. Their brains are essentially little sponges designed to soak up social dynamics. When they watch TV, they aren't just passively absorbing a story, they're actively taking notes. Active mimicry is the process where toddlers use on-screen toxic reactions as a literal blueprint for their own behavior. If a character like Lu takes mean-spirited revenge when a friend accidentally spills paint, a toddler watching is highly likely to log that reaction and replicate that exact vengeful behavior in a real-world nursery setting. They see it, they store it, they do it. All right, this brings us to Chapter 6, which episode deserves a ban? It's time for the verdict. Let's look at the culmination of the media watchdog investigation. To reach a final conclusion, watchdogs look at a direct side-by-side comparison of the two broadcasts. As you can see, for Something Special, the core issue was a visual scare, and the resulting audience impact was temporary fright. For Lu and the Bally Bunch, the core issue was modeled bad behavior, and the audience impact was the actual replication of bratty actions by young viewers in the real world. Regulators and watchdogs always have to weigh the original intent of the program against the real long-term impact on the target audience. The final conclusion drawn by regulators really comes down to the fundamental difference between a scare and a snare. Let that distinction sink in for a moment. Scaring kids with a large, sudden headdress was simply an aesthetic mistake. It was a miscalculation in an error in judgment regarding visual intensity. But providing a blueprint for toxic social skills, that is a snare. It's a systemic behavioral issue that actively undermines a child's social development long after the TV is turned off. Because counting spaghetti essentially teaches kids how to be mean to their friends, it is considered the true, most valid candidate for a ban. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Should children's TV protect kids from fear or protect them from bad behavior? It's a really fascinating look at the true psychological impact of the media we show our children. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.